Welcome to the FanDuel Punch-Out. I'm Jason Gilbo, JGilbo11, and taking a look at today's 7-game slate here on FanDuel. And you look at pitching, I mean, it's not going to really leave you anything strapped. I mean, you plug in a Tanner Roark, you get 3250 left over, which is nice. Jumping right into the thing, you're looking at catcher. And for me, with things being kind of closely priced, as far as in comparison to DK, we had a little bit of difference. Ramos is kind of my definitely preferred play as far as cash games and GPPs go at 3,200. I mean, the guy has been hitting well over 400 against righties. ISO sitting over 2, so that's nice. And look at Lucroy. I mean, I do like Lucroy in GPPs. He's in the midst of a nice little hot streak there. Going up against Kazmir, who's a relatively easier matchup than Johnson for Ramos. Same thing with McCann for Gibson. I don't mind Lucroy and McCann in GPPs. It's going to be kind of hard for me to swerve in a lot of lines, but I think if you're looking at a little bit lower ownership or looking to hedge a little bit differently, those kind of two would be the way to go. These Yankee bats are kind of in a favorable spot. Target field heats up a little bit more in the summertime, so it's not a bad ballpark to hit in, and a relatively high over-under as well there. So with guys like Silva or Perez, I mean, obviously he's coming off another big game, maybe back-to-back games with a homer. The guy has 4 homers in about the last 6 or 7 games there. 3,100, I mean, you're kind of going against the grain if you want to push even lower ownership with a guy like Russell Martin or Perez in the tougher matchups of the night. Because if you are looking, I mean, Nola and Verlander are kind of the most talented arms. And you might not necessarily be using them. You might be leaning towards a Roark or a Happer or a Kazmir, and you can kind of take some shots against them possibly. So on a 7-game slate, you have that option. With that being said, I still think Ramos at 3,200 is kind of my preferred play. I mentioned Matt Wieters on the DK pod. Not really an option for me here because there's not really a price difference in between. If Victor Martinez somehow showed up in the option or into the lineup today, which I doubt he does because he's banged up, he would be in play at 2,800. Spinning down, though, I mean, James McCann at 22 is kind of the punt option just because, one, he's got an ISO over 200 against lefties, near 330 WOBA, which is nice. So I think you can kind of look at him as kind of the only real punt option there, unless you see someone when lineups come out that opens things up and they're kind of hitting that top half of the order. Moving on to first base here, and with Encarnacion facing Aaron Nola there, it kind of takes him off the table. He's come off a big game. You can look at the Jays' bats as far as GPPs go. I don't think it's a bad option. It's not one I'm going to have a ton of exposure to because Nola is one of the more talented arms. He's tough on right-handers, so I think you can kind of stay away for the most part. But if you are looking to build multiple lineups, build multiple stacks, you can definitely toss in the Jays one just because of those upsides. But overall, I mean, Ortiz is kind of that guy for me that I'm locking in. Miguel Cabrera not really on the table, just given he's 300 less. You're looking at what Ortiz has done. He's been far more consistent, far more upside. He's got everything you kind of really want as far as a GPP and cash game guy. Ortiz 480 WOBA, 393 ISO this season. He's kind of unmatched against everyone else here. And Wilson, not really a strong arm either way. And with that being said, I mean, guys like Hosmer, Davis, Will Myers, Chris Carter, you can look at them at GPPs. Their options are going to be pretty low owned. I mean, they're not in bad spots. I mean, Myers, I'm not really looking at targeting against Roark. Hosmer against Verlander, you can look at Chris Carter against Kazmir. I mean, we mentioned some of those Brewers bats on the pitcher pod that could possibly get to Kazmir. You could look at them as some of the GPP moves, but outside of that, I mean, there's 2 guys down here that have been kind of struggling this season, but they are in better spots than those guys named above. Adrian Gonzalez against Junior Guerra and Ryan Zimmerman at 3K. I like this Nationals offense quite a bit. Zimmerman hasn't been the most consistent this season. 315 WOBA off right-handed pitching, 185 ISO. Not terrible numbers, but they definitely could be better. At the price tag, though, I mean, you're getting a pretty steep drop down from Ortiz, which is nice. And if you kind of get that homer, get that upside from Zimmerman, it'll pay off nicely. And overall, I mean, Johnson, 355 WOBA to righties, 1.77 home runs per 9. Even with that game at Petco, I'm not really scared off of this Nationals offense, and I like them quite a bit. So the one thing about this thing, I mean, if you are plugging in Roark, I mean, you can only list 3 other Washington bats. You don't kind of get that full stack in there, so that's something to consider. But overall, I mean, Adrian Gonzalez is another one. Guerra, his FIP, his batted ball stats, it shows that some regression is coming soon. So overall, I mean, you're looking at Gonzalez, 321 off righties this season. The power hasn't really been there. But at the price tag, I'm willing to take a shot at him in GPPs. But outside that, I do think you pay up for Ortiz in cash games and kind of lock him in because really the price tag's not really that bad to do that with. Moving on to second base here, and kind of like DraftKings, you have Kinsler, Pedroia, and Murphy all up in that same price tier. Kinsler kind of my favorite option there just because, one, he's been crushing lefties this season. Wobo over 400, 232 ISO on the season, which is nice. I think he's a great one-off. I think he's a great value or piece of that Tiger stack that you're going 1 through 4 with. You can kind of mix and match because guys like Upton, Castellanos, they all might necessarily be in that same order of just strictly 1 through 4. But I do like them quite a bit. Pedroia, he's only really in play for me if I'm working in a Red Sox stack at 3,800. Obviously him, I mean, not a ton of upside out of him. He kind of just works his way in. He'll give you a night like last night where he's 2 for 4 with a run and a walk, stuff like that. At 3,800, I don't necessarily need that. I'd rather spin up for a higher upside player like Daniel Murphy or Kinsler. But Pedroia kind of fits that piece only really in a Boston stack. And mentioning Murphy, 3,800, starting to come back down to earth a little bit here, but in a great matchup. Pecco, pretty neutral for lefty power, so I don't mind these Nats left-handers. And Murphy at that price is not bad either. Brian Dozier, 3,400. I think if you're looking, you're going to probably catch a lot of people looking at CC Sabathia as far as GPPs on FanDuel just because that price tag's super cheap at 7,200. But, the Twins do strike out a ton against lefties. You're obviously looking at a matchup where Sabathia could thrive, but you also look at some right-handed bats that do have a nice track record again34 lefties, and Dozier, 434 Woboff Southpaws this season. That's an intriguing matchup for him. Not a bad price tag, a kind of spin-down option off of those top guys. And then if you're going lower, we talked about on the pitcher pod that the Mets-Pirates game could be a game to kind of look for value, and Josh Harrison at 2,600 is something I'm looking at. Colon's been serviceable, but not a guy I'm really not kind of avoiding, honestly. I'm not going to be all over the Pirates, but I think you kind of work some value in against them. Because one, Devin Travis at 2,800, not in a great spot there, even though he's starting to come around a bit. 2 hits in the last 3 games, tough spot there against Nola. Starling Castro, I mean, he's kind of a guy who you pick in the right spots. If he's somewhere up in the top of the order, you can kind of look at him. Outside of that, there's not guys to really punt down to, and you don't really need to on this slate here. Third base, this one a little bit different. I mean, Donaldson at 4,300, and then you got a big $1,100 drop off to Justin Turner, who really comes in for me. I mean, with Donaldson against Nola, who's strictly a GPP play, you can spin down to a Turner, you can spin down to a Rendon, Castellanos, Jung Ho Kang, and Castellanos is a guy I like much more here on FanDuel and GPPs than I do on DraftKings because that price tag is super cheap. He was about 4,800 on DK. If that's anything to let you know that they're expecting a big game out of him and that Tigers offense, you can use that theory and kind of use Castellanos at 3K here. Not really a cash game guy for me. I kind of like Jung Ho Kang a little bit more. He's the guy who's been on fire. I mean, Woba over 300 or over 400 against right-handed pitching. ISO's been up there in the stratosphere. He's been very solid. And same thing with Travis Shaw, 2,900. I like him in GPPs as well. So there are a number of cheap options that you can kind of go with. They're not going to cash strap you, which is nice. I think if you kind of check off all the boxes here, Jung Ho Kang's kind of been a guy who I'm looking at. I think he's kind of my preferred play out of that. I don't think you need to punt, but if you're looking to do so, if you're looking to be different, if you're going stars and scrubs, if you're paying up for someone else, if you're doing whatever, Hernan Perez, 3,700, or 2,300 is a guy to look at just because ISO over 200 against lefties. Scott Kazmir, I mean, boomer bust type pitcher at this point in his career. Been pitching a little bit better of late, but still has had those blowups at times. And you're looking at the Brewers offense that is heavily right-handed. It is a fairly low total, so I do think it's more of a GPP move, if anything. And same thing for kind of Trevor Plouffe along the lines of Dozier. You can kind of look at him as GPPs as well. Decent track record, decent ISO numbers against lefties in his career as well. Moving on to shortstop here, and once again, I think you're looking at Bogarts and Machado as kind of the top options. Corey Seager in play as far as GPPs go. I'm not really looking at him in cash games. I think Bogarts and Machado is the easier move. You're looking at Wilson, not a strong arm there. You're obviously looking at Machado. I mean, isn't necessarily great against lefties, but has hit them fairly well this season. And Eduardo Rodriguez hasn't been the strongest arm, so I do think you can kind of look at those Baltimore right-handed bats, and Machado included their shortstop, which is nice. But Bogaerts has been kind of more the reliable get-on-base guy, and even has shown some upside. I mean, you look at that Minnesota series. I mean, he had 8 RBIs, 2 homers, 2 hit, 4 hit games. So the way he's hitting the ball and the way he's hitting the ball for extra base hits and kind of doing the extra peripheral stuff is what you like about that. I do think you can kind of spin down to a Jonathan Villar at 3,300 in GPPs. I like him quite a bit just because he's hit lefties pretty well this season. 413 WOBA, 176 ISO, has stolen base upside. So at that price tag, I mean, he struggled a little bit, so that price has come down. He was near 4K, a week or two ago. So you can kind of look that route. I mentioned Asdrubal Cabrera at 2,800. Not a bad option just because Nicasio has really struggled with left-handed bats. He's allowed a WOBA over 400 since 2014 at 1.52 runs per 9. If you're looking at some of these lefty Mets guys in GPPs, I don't think it's a bad move. I don't think one-offs as far as value go. I don't hate the move. I think the Mets, I mean, we saw big runs last night against Jeff Locke, and Nicasio isn't really that much stronger. So I do think it's kind of intriguing play, which is why I'm so hesitant as far as both sides of why that over-under is so low. But Vegas has it pinned. I'm hoping that keeps ownership low as well. So you can definitely kind of go that route. Once again, you don't really need to spin down a shortstop. There's no Tim Anderson on the slate, so there's no real punt to really look at. As far as outfield goes, Bryce Harper at 4K is the guy who I'm kind of looking at in that tier. I'm not a big fan of Brett Gardner at 3,700. You can look at Betts. He's kind of like a Pedroia where he makes a better one-off than Pedroia does, but obviously I'm more looking to use him in a Red Sox stack. I do like Bryce Harper. You're looking at Johnson, who's been awful against lefties, 4.11 WOBA to lefties in his career, 2.10 home runs per 9. So Petco, as I mentioned with Murphy, pretty average for lefty power, so it's not necessarily a stay-away situation, even in one of the poor ballparks on the night. Gregory Polanco is a guy I'm looking at, 3,600. He's been crushing right-handed pitching this year, stolen base upside, which is nice. Not a bad price tag for him to go up against Cologne at. And in that same price tag, Jacoby Ellsbury as well, who's been hitting well. So 2 kind of 3,600 guys that you can maybe even start off your lineups with as far as the outfield goes and get some quality outfielders in there. One guy who I liked on DK that I don't really like so much on DraftKings or on FanDuel here is Robbie Grossman's price tag at 3,600. He's much cheaper on DK. He is still a viable GPP option here, but I listed him as cash on DK. A little bit different here, just because I think you can look at Cespedes, Trumbo, Ryan Braun. There's more kind of consistent options, even a Jackie Bradley Jr. That tier I like quite a bit more. And if you spin down, I talked about McCutcheon's price tag. It's really starting to drop because his production's been awful this season. You're taking chances that maybe one game he turns it around. It is possible. So I don't hate the move, even against a Bartolo Colon, but something's up with him. I don't know if he's injured, if the hand's up. So, overall, I do think he's still in play as far as the Pirates go tonight because he's not a 3,800 where you're taking an even bigger risk at. 2,900, Justin Upton, still a GPP option for me against the lefty Danny Duffy. Upton showed some relatively high upside of late, some stolen base and power upside, which is nice. So I think you can look at him at that price tag still. Definitely boomer bust type play out in Kauffman Stadium, so it's not the greatest ballpark to hit in. But he's about as cheap as I'll go. You can look and see who's leading off for Washington. Whoever's leading off will become kind of a decent value play up against Johnson, who really hasn't been great this season. So that should open up some value there for your lineups. And once again, I've been pretty high on that Nationals offense, really kind of outside of that Red Sox-Orioles game is kind of my secondary piece. So that's going to wrap things up here with the FanDuel Punch-Out. Be sure to check out dailyfantasycafe.com for all great tools and content.